Today's story is The Perfect Murder by Stacy Aumonier from the Rupa Book of Great Crime Stories, edited by Ruskin Bond. One evening in November, two brothers were seated in a little cafe in the Rue de la Roche discussing murders. The evening papers lay in front of them, and they all contained a lurid account of a shocking affair in the Landis district, where a charcoal burner had killed his wife and two children with a hatchet. From discussing this murder in particular, they went on to discussing murder in general. I have never yet read a murder case without being impressed by the extraordinary clumsiness of it, remarked Paul, the younger brother. Here's this fellow who murders his victims with his own hatchet, leaves his hat behind in the shed, and arrives at a village hard by with blood on his boots. They'll lose their heads, said Henry, the elder. In cases like that, they're mentally unbalanced, hardly responsible for their actions. Yes, replied Paul, but what impresses me is what a lot of murders must be done by people who take trouble, who leave not a trace behind. Henry shrugged his shoulders. I shouldn't think it was so easy, old boy. There's always something that crops up. Nonsense. I will guarantee there are thousands done every year. If you are living with anyone, for instance, it must be the easiest thing in the world to murder them. How? Oh, some kind of accident. And then you go screaming into the street, oh, my poor wife, help. You burst into tears and everyone consoles you. I read of a woman somewhere who murdered her husband by leaving the window near the bed open at night when he was suffering from pneumonia. Who's going to suspect a case like that? Instead of that, people must always select revolvers or knives or go and buy poison at the chemist's across the way. It sounds as though you are contemplating a murder yourself, laughed Henry. Well, you never know, answered Paul. Circumstances might arise when a murder would be the only way out of a difficulty. If ever my time comes, I shall take a lot of trouble about it. I promise you, I shall leave no trace behind. As Henry glanced at his brother making this remark, he was struck by the fact that there was indeed nothing irreconcilable between the idea of a murder and the idea of Paul doing it. He was a big, saturnine looking gentleman with a shallow, dissolute face, framed in a black square beard and swathes of untidy grey hair. His profession was that of a traveller in cheap jewellery, and his business dealings were not always of the straightest. Henry shuddered. With his own puny physique, bad health, and vacillating will, he was always dominated by his younger brother. He himself was a clerk in a drapery store, and he had a wife and three children. Paul was unmarried. The brothers saw a good deal of each other and were very intimate. But the word friendship would be an extravagant term to apply to their relationship. They were both always hard up, and they borrowed money from each other when every other sources failed. They had no other relatives except a very old uncle and aunt who lived in Chantilly. This uncle and aunt, whose name was Thailandier, were fairly well off, but they would have little to do with the two nephews. They were occasionally invited there to dinner, but neither Paul nor Henry ever succeeded in extracting a franc out of Uncle Robert. He was a very religious man, hard-fisted, cantankerous, and intolerant. His wife was a little more pliable. She was in effect an eccentric. She had spasms of generosity, during which periods both the brothers had at times managed to get money out of her. But these were rare occasions. Moreover, the old man kept her so short of cash that she found it difficult to help her nephews even if she desired to. As stated, the discussions between the two brothers occurred in November. It was presumably forgotten by both of them immediately afterwards. And indeed, there is no reason to believe that it would have ever have recurred except for certain events which followed the sudden death of Uncle Robert in the February of the following year. In the meantime, the affairs of both Paul and Henry had gone disastrously. Paul had been detected in a dishonest transaction over a paste trinket and had just been released from a period of imprisonment. The knowledge of this had not reached his uncle before his death. Henry's wife had another baby and had been very ill. He was more in debt than ever. The news of the uncle's death came as a gleam of hope in the darkness of despair. What kind of will had he left? Knowing their uncle, each was convinced that, however it was framed, there was likely to be little or nothing for them. However, the old villain might have left them 1,000 or two. And in any case, if the money was all left to the wife, here was a possible field of plunder. It need hardly to be said that they repaired with all haste to the funeral, and even with greater alacrity to the lawyer's reading of the will. The will contained surprises, both encouraging and discouraging. In the first place, the old man left a considerably larger fortune than anyone could have anticipated. In the second place, all the money and securities were carefully tied up and placed under the control of trustees. There were large bequests to religious charities, while the residue was held in trust for his wife. But so far as the brothers were concerned, the surprise came at the end. On her death, this residue was still to be held in trust, but a portion of the interest was to be divided between Henry and Paul, and on their death to go to the church. The old man had recognized a certain call of the blood after all. They both behaved with tact and discretion at the funeral, and were extremely sympathetic and solicitous towards Aunt Rosalie, who was too absorbed with her own trouble to take much notice of them. It was only when it came to the reading of the will that their avidity and interest outraged, perhaps, the strict canons of good taste. It was Paul who managed to get it clear from the notary what the exact amount would probably be, making allowances for fluctuations, accidents, and acts of God. On the death of Thaillandier, the two brothers would inherit something between 8 and 10,000 francs a year each. She was 82 and very frail. The brothers celebrated the good news with a carouse up in the Montmartre. Naturally, their chief topic of conversation was how long the old bird would keen on her perch. In any case, could not be many years. With any luck, it might be only a few weeks. The fortune seemed blinding. It would mean comfort and security to the end of their days. The rejoicings were mixed with recriminations against the old man for his stinginess. Why couldn't he have left them a lump sum down now? Why did he want to waste all this good gold on the church? Why all this trusty business? There was a little they could do but await developments. Except that in the meantime, after a decent interval, they might try and touch the old lady for a bit. They parted, and the next day set about their business in cheerious spirits. For a time, they were extremely tactful. They made formal calls on Aunt Rosalie, inquiring after her health and offering their services in any capacity whatsoever. But at the end of a month, Henry called hurriedly one morning, and after the usual professions of solicitude, asked his aunt if she could possibly lend him 120 francs to pay the doctor who had attended his wife and baby. She lent him 40, grumbling at his foolishness at having children he could not afford to keep. A week later came Paul with a story about being robbed by a client. He wanted 100. She lent him 10. When these appeals had been repeated 3 or 4 times and received similar treatment, and sometimes no treatment at all, the old lady began to get annoyed. She was becoming more and more eccentric. She now had a companion, an angular, middle-aged woman named Shivane, who appeared like a protecting goddess. Sometimes when the brothers called, Shivane would say that Thailandia was too unwell to see anyone. If this news had been true, it would have been good news indeed, but the brothers suspected that it was all prearranged. 2 years went by and they both began to despair. She may live to 100, said Paul. We shall die of old age first, grumbled Henry. It was difficult to borrow money on the strength of the will. In the first place, their friends were more of the borrowing than the lending class, and anyone who had a little was suspicious of the story and wanted all kinds of securities. It was Paul who first thought of going to an insurance company to try to raise money on the reversionary interest. They did succeed in the end in getting an insurance company to advance them 2,000 francs each. But the negotiations took 5 months to complete. And by the time they had insured their lives, paid the lawyers' fees, and paid for the various deeds and stamps and signed some 30 or 40 forms, each man only received a little over 1,000 francs, which was quickly lost in paying accrued debts and squandering the remainder. Their hopes were raised by the dismissal of Marshawani, only to be lowered again by the arrival of an even more aggressive companion. The companions came and went with startling rapidity. None of them could stand for any time the old lady's eccentricity and ill temper. The whole of the staff was always being changed. The only one who remained loyal all through was the portly cook, Ernestine. Even this may have been due to the fact that she never came in touch with her mistress. She was an excellent cook and she never moved from the kitchen. Moreover, the cooking required by Ma Thailandier was of the simplest nature and she seldom entertained. And she hardly ever left her apartment. Any complaints that were made through the housekeeper, and the complaints and their relations became mellowed in the process, for Ernestine also had a temper of her own. Nearly another year passed before what appeared to Paul to be a mild stroke of good fortune came his way. Things had been going from bad to worse. Neither of the brothers was in a position to lend a sou to the other. Henry's family was becoming a greater drag, and people were not buying Paul's trinkets. One day, during an interview with his aunt, he had been trying to borrow more money. He fainted in her presence. It is difficult to know what it was about this act which affected the old lady, but she ordered him to be put to bed in one of the rooms of the villa. Possibly, she jumped to the conclusion that he had fainted from lack of food, which was not true. Paul never went without food and drink, and she suddenly realized that after all, he was her husband's sister's son. He must certainly have looked pathetic, this white-faced man, well past middle age and broken in life. Whatever it was, she showed a broad streak of compassion for him. She ordered her servants to look after him and to allow him to remain until she countermanded the order. Paul, who had suddenly felt faint but quickly seized the occasion to make it as dramatic as possible, saw in this an opportunity to wheedle his way into his aunt's favors. His behavior was exemplary. The next morning, looking very white and shaky, he visited her and asked her to allow him to go, as he had no idea of abusing her hospitality. If he had taken up the opposite attitude, she would probably have turned him out. But because he suggested going, she ordered him to stop. During the daytime, he went about his dubious business, but he continued to return there at night to sleep and to enjoy a good dinner cooked by the admirable Ernestine. He was in clover. Henry was naturally envious when he heard of his brother's good fortune, and Paul was fearful that Henry would spoil the whole game by going and throwing a fit himself in the presence of the aunt. But this, of course, would have been too obvious and foolish for even Henry to consider seriously. And he racked his brains for some means of inviting the old lady. Every plan he put forth, however, Paul sat upon. He was quite comfortable himself, and he didn't see the point of his brother butting in. Besides, he said, she may turn me out any day. Then you can have your shot. They quarreled about this and did not see each other for some time. One would have thought that Henry's apple to mouth Thailandier would have been stronger than Paul's. He was a struggling individual with a wife and 4 children. Paul was a notorious ne'er-do-well and he had no attachments. Nevertheless, the old lady continued to support Paul. Perhaps it was because he was a big man and she liked big men. Her husband had been a man of fine physique. Henry was puny and she despised him. She had never had children of her own and she disliked children. She was always upbraiding Henry and his wife for their fecundity. Any attempt to pander to her emotions through the sentiment of childhood failed. She would not have the children in her house, and any small acts of charity which she bestowed upon them seemed to be done more with the idea of giving her an opportunity to inflict her sarcasm and venom upon them than out of kindness of heart. In Paul, on the other hand, she seemed to find something slightly attractive. She sometimes sent for him, and he, all agog, expecting to get his notice to quit, would be agreeably surprised to find that, on the contrary, she had some little commission she wished him to execute. And you may rest assured that he never failed to make a few francs out of all these occasions. The notice to quit did not come. It may be, poor deluded woman, that she regarded him as some kind of protection. He was, in any case, the only man who slept under her roof. At first, she seldom spoke to him, but as time went on, she would sometimes send for him to relieve her loneliness. Nothing could have been more ingratiating than Paul's manners in these circumstances. He talked expansively about politics, knowing beforehand his aunt's views and just what she would like him to say. Her eyesight was very bad, and he would read for her the news of the day and tell her what was happening in Paris. He humored her every whim. He was astute enough to see that it would be foolish and dangerous to attempt to borrow money for the moment. He was biding his time and trying to think out most of the profitable plan of campaign. There was no immediate hurry. His bed was comfortable and Ernestine's cooking was excellent. In another year's time, he had established himself as quite one of the permanent household. He was consulted about the servants and the doctors and the management of the house, everything except the control of money, which was jealously guarded by a firm of lawyers. Many a time he would curse his uncle's foresight. The old man's spirit seemed to be hovering in the dim recesses of the overcrowded rooms, mocking him. For the old lady, eccentric and foolish in many ways, kept a strict check upon her dividends. It was her absorbing interest in life, that and an old grey paroquet which she treated like a child. Its name was Anna, and it used to walk up and down her table at meal times and feed off her own plate. Finding himself so firmly entrenched, Paul's assurance gradually increased. He began to treat his aunt as an equal, and sometimes even to contradict her, and she did not seem to resent it. In the meantime, Henry was eating his heart out with jealousy and sullen rage. The whole thing was unfair. He occasionally saw Paul, who boasted openly of his strong position in the Thailandier household, and he would not believe that Paul was getting money out of the old lady as well as board and lodging. With no additional expenses, Paul was better dressed than he used to be, and he looked fatter and better in health. All, or nearly all, of Henry's appeals, although pitched in a most pathetic key, were rebuffed. He felt a bitter hatred against his aunt, his brother, and life in general. If only she would die. What was the good of life to a woman at 85 or 6? And there he was, 4 young children clamoring for food and clothes and the ordinary decent comforts. And there was Paul, idling his days away at cafes and his nights at cabarets, nothing to do and no responsibilities. Meeting Paul one day, he said, I say, old boy, couldn't you spring me 100 francs? I haven't the money to pay my rent next week. She gives me nothing, replied Paul. Henry did not believe this, but it would be undiplomatic to quarrel. He said, Aren't there? Isn't there some little thing lying about the villa you could slip in your pocket? We could sell it, see? Go shears, I am desperately pushed. Paul looked down his nose. Name of a pig! Did Henry think he had never thought of that? Many and many times the temptation had come to him. But no, every few months people came from the lawyer's office and the inventory of the whole household was checked. The servants could not be suspected. They were not selected without irreproachable characters. If he were suspected, well, all kinds of unpleasant things might crop up. Oh no, he was too well off where he was. The game was to lie in wait. The old lady simply must die soon. She had even been complaining of her chest that morning. She was always playing with the paroquet. Somehow, this bird got on Paul's nerves. He wanted to wring its neck. He imitated the way she should say, There's a pretty lady. Oh, my sweet. Another nice grape for my little one. There's a pretty lady. He told Henry all about this, and the elder brother went on his way with a grunt that only conveyed doubt and suspicion. In view of this position, it seemed strange that in the end it was Paul who was directly responsible for the denouement in the Thailandian household. His success went to his rather weak head like wine. He began to swagger and bluster and abuse his aunt's hospitality. And curiously enough, the more he advanced, the further she withdrew. The eccentric old lady seemed to be losing her powers of resistance so far as he was concerned. And he began to borrow small sums of money from her, and as she acquiesced so readily to increase his demands. He let his traveling business go, and sometimes he would get lost for days at a time. He would spend his time at the races and drinking with doubtful acquaintances in obscure cafes. Sometimes he won, but in the majority of cases, he lost. He ran up bills and got into debt. By cajoling some sums out of his aunt, he kept his debtors at bay for nearly 9 months. But one evening, he came to see Henry in a great state of distress. His face, which had taken on a healthier glow when he first went to live with his aunt, had become puffy and livid. His eyes were bloodshot. Old boy, he said, I am at my wits' end. I have got to find 7,000 francs by the 21st of the month, or they are going to foreclose. How do you stand? I will pay you back. To try to borrow money from Henry was like appealing to the desert for a cooling draught. He also had to find money by the 21st, and he was overdrawn at the bank. They exchanged confidences, and in their mutual distress, they felt sorry for each other and for themselves. It was a November evening, and the rain was driving along the boulevards in the fitful gusts. After trudging a long way, they turned into a little cafe in the Rue de la Roche and sat down and ordered 2 cognacs. The cafe was almost deserted. A few men in mackintoshes were scattered around reading the evening papers. They sat at a marble table in the corner and tried to think of ways and means. But after a time, a silence fell between them. There seemed nothing more to suggest. They could hear the rain beating on the skylight, and old man 4 tables away was poring over La Patrie. Suddenly, Henry looked furtively around the room and clutched his brother's arm. Paul, he whispered, what is it? Do you remember? It has all come back to me. Suddenly, one night, a night something like this. It must be 5 or 6 years ago. We were seated here in the same cafe. Do you remember? No, I don't remember. What was it? It was the night of that murder in the Landers district we got talking about. Don't you remember? Paul scratched his temple and sipped the cognac. Henry leaned closer to him. You said, you said that if you lived with anyone, it was the easiest thing in the world to murder them. An accident, and you go screaming into the street. Paul started and stared at his brother, who continued, you said that if ever you had to do it, you would guarantee that you would take every trouble. You wouldn't leave a trace behind. Paul was acting. He pretended to half remember, to half understand. But his eyes narrowed. Imbecile. Hadn't he been through it all in imagination 100 times? Hadn't he already been planning and scheming an act for which his brother would reap half the benefit? Nevertheless, he was staggered. He never imagined that the suggestion would come from Henry. He was secretly relieved. If Henry was to receive half the benefit, let him also share half the responsibilities. The risk in any case would be wholly his. He grinned enigmatically, and they put their heads together. And so, in that dim corner of the cafe was planned the perfect murder. Coming up against the actual proposition, Paul had long since realized that the affair was not so easy of accomplishment as he had so airily suggested. For the first thing must be done without violence, without clues, without trace. Such ideas as leaving the windows open at night were out of the question, as the companions slept in the same room. Moreover, the old lady was quite capable of getting out of bed and shutting it herself if she felt a draught. Some kind of accident? Yes, but what? Suppose she slipped and broke her neck when Paul was in the room? It would be altogether too suspicious. Besides, she would probably only partially break her neck. She would regain sufficient consciousness to tell. To drown her in her bath, the door was always locked or the companion hovering around. You have always got to remember, whispered Paul, if any suspicion falls on me, there's the motive. There's strong motive why I should. It's got to be absolutely untraceable. I don't care if some people do suspect afterwards when we have got the money. What about her food? The food is cooked by Ernestine, and a companion serves it. Besides, suppose I got a chance to tamper with the food, how am I going to get hold of, you know, wheat killer? Yes, I should be in a pretty position if they trace the fact that I had bought wheat killer. You might buy some and let me have a little on the quiet. Henry turned pale. No, no, the motive applies to me too. They would get us both. When the two pleasant gentlemen parted at midnight, their plans were still very immature, but they arranged to meet the following evening. It was the 13th of the month. To save the situation, the deed must be accomplished within 8 days. Of course, they wouldn't get the money at once, but knowing the circumstances, creditors would be willing to wait. When they met the following evening in the Café de Saint-Thiers, Paul appeared flushed and excited, and Henry was pale and on edge. He hadn't slept. He wanted to wash the whole thing out. And sell up your home, I suppose, sneered Paul. Listen, my little cabbage, I have got it. Don't distress yourself. You proposed this last night. I have been thinking about it and watching for months. Ernestine is a good cook and very methodical. Oh, very methodical. She does everything every day in the same way, exactly to schedule. My apartment is on the same floor, so I am able to appreciate her punctuality and exactness. The old woman eats sparingly and according to routine. One night she has fish, the next night she has a souffle made with 2 eggs. Fish, souffle, regular as the beat of a clock. Now listen. After lunch, every day Ernestine washes up the plates and pans. After that, she prepares roughly the evening meal. If it is a fish night, she prepares the fish ready to pop into the pan. If it is a souffle night, she beats up 2 eggs and puts them ready in a basin. Having done that, she changes her frock, powders her nose, and goes over to the convent to see her sister who is working there. She is away an hour and a half. She returns punctually at 4 o'clock. You could set your watch by her movements. Yes, but it is difficult to insert what I propose in fish. But I don't see any difficulty in dropping it into 2 beaten up eggs and giving an extra twist to the egg whisk or whatever they call it. Henry's face was quite grey. But, Paul, how are you going to get hold of the poison? Who said anything about poison? Well, but what? That's where you come in. I. Yes, you are in too, aren't you? You get half the spoils, don't you? Why shouldn't you? Sometime tomorrow when your wife's out. What? Just grind up a piece of glass. Glass? Yes, you have heard of glass, haven't you? An ordinary piece of broken wine glass will do. Grind it up as fine as a powder. The finer the better, the finer the more effective. Henry gasped. No, no, he couldn't do this thing. Very well, then. If he was such a coward, Paul would have to do it himself. And perhaps when the time came, Henry would also be too frightened to draw his dividends. Perhaps he would like to make them over to his dear brother Paul. Come, it was only a little thing to do. 8 days to the 21st. Tomorrow, fish day, but Wednesday would be souffle. So easy, so untraceable, so safe. But you, went Henry. They will suspect you. Even if they do, they can prove anything. But in order to avoid this unpleasantness, I propose to leave home soon after breakfast. I shall return at 3:15, letting myself in through the stable yard. The stables, as you know, are not used. There is no one else on that floor. Ernestine is upstairs. She only comes down to answer the front doorbell. I shall be in and out of the house within 5 minutes, and I shan't return till late at night, when perhaps I may be too late to render assistance. Henry was terribly agitated. On one hand was just murder, a thing he had never connected himself with in his life. On the other hand was comfort for himself and his family, an experience he had given up hoping for. It was in any case not exactly murder on his part. It was Paul's murder. At the same time, knowing all about it, being an accessory before the fact, it would seem contemplatively to a degree to put the whole onus on Paul. Grinding up a piece of glass was such a little thing. It couldn't possibly incriminate him. Nobody could ever prove that he had done it. But it was a terrible step to take. Have another cognac, my little cabbage. It was Paul's voice that jerked him back to actuality. He said, all right, yes, yes. But whether this referred to the cognac or to the act of grinding up a piece of glass, he hardly knew himself. From that moment to 24 hours later, when he handed over a white packet to his brother across the same table at the Café de Saint-Thiers, Henry seemed to be in a nightmarish dream. He had no recollection of how he had passed the time. He seemed to pass from the last cognac this one, and the interval was a blank. Fish today, souffle tomorrow, he heard Paul chuckling. Brother, you have done your work well. When Paul went, he wanted to call after him to come back, but he was frightened of the sound of his own voice. He was terribly frightened. He went to bed very late and could not sleep. The next morning he awoke with a headache, and he got his wife to telegraph to the office to say that he was too ill to come. He lay in bed all day, visualizing over and over and over again the possible events of the evening. Paul would be caught. Someone would catch him actually putting the powder into the eggs. He would be arrested. Paul would give him away. Why did Paul say it was so easy to murder anyone if you lived with them? It wasn't easy at all. The whole thing was chock-a-block with dangers and pitfalls. Pitfalls? At 3:30 he started up in bed. He had a vision of himself and Paul being guillotined side by side. He must stop it at any cost. He began to get up. Then he realized that it was already too late. The deed had been done. Paul had said that he would be in and out of the house within 5 minutes at 3:15, a quarter of an hour ago. Where was Paul? Would he be coming to see him? He was going to spend the evening out somewhere, returning late at night. He dressed feverishly. There was still time. He could call at his aunt's, rush down to the kitchen, seize the basin of beaten up eggs, and throw them away. But where? How? By the time he got there, Ernestine would have returned. She would want to know all about it. The egg mixture would be examined, analyzed. God in heaven, it was too late. The thing would have to go on, and he suffer and wait. Having dressed, he went out after saying to his wife, "It's all right. It's going to be all right," not exactly knowing what he meant. He walked rapidly along the streets with no fixed destination in his mind. He found himself in the cafe in the Rue de la Roche, where the idea was first conceived, where he had reminded his brother. He sat there drinking, waiting for the hours to pass. Souffle day, and the old lady dined at 7. It was now not quite 5. He hoped Paul would turn up. A stranger tried to engage him conversation. The stranger apparently had some grievance against a railway company. He wanted to tell him all the details about a contract for rivets over which he had been disappointed. Henry didn't understand a word he was talking about. He didn't listen. He wanted the stranger to drop down dead or vanish into thin air. At last he called the waiter and paid for his reckoning, indicated by a small pile of sauces. From there, he walked rapidly to the Café de Saint-Stairs, looking for Paul. He was not there. 6 o'clock. 1 hour more. He could not keep still. He paid and went on, calling at cafe after cafe. 7:15. Pray God that she threw it away. Had he ground it fine enough? 5 minutes to 7. 7 o'clock. Now. He picked up his hat and went again. The brandy had gone to his head. At 7:30, he laughed recklessly. After all, what was the good of life to this old woman of 86? He tried to convince himself that he had done it for the sake of his wife and children. He tried to concentrate on the future. How could he manage on 8 or 10,000 francs a year? How could give notice at the office, be rude to people who had been bullying him for years? That old blackguard Mukin. At 10 o'clock, he was drunk, torpid, and indifferent. The whole thing was over for good or ill. What did it matter? He terribly wanted to see Paul, but he was too tired to care very much. The irrevocable step had been taken. He went home to bed and fell into a heavy drunken sleep. "Henry, Henry, wake up! What is the matter with you?" His wife was shaking him. He blinked his way into a partial condition of consciousness. November sunlight was pouring into the room. "It's late, isn't it?" he said involuntarily. "It's past 8. You will be late at the office. You didn't go yesterday. If you go on like this, you will get the sack. And then what shall we do?" Slowly, the recollection of last night's events came back to him. "There's nothing to worry about," he said. "I am too ill to go today. Send them another telegram. It will be all right." His wife looked at him searchingly. "You have been drinking," she said. "Oh, you men, God knows what will become of us." She appeared to be weeping in her apron. It struck him forcibly at that instant how provoking and small women are. Here was Janet crying over her petty troubles, whereas he... The whole thing was becoming vivid again. Where was Paul? What had happened? Was it at all likely that he could go down to an office on a day like this? A day that was to decide his fate? He groaned and elaborated rather pathetically his imaginary ailments, anything to keep this woman quiet. She left him at last, and he lay there waiting for something to happen. The hours passed. What would be the first intimation? Paul or the gentleman's? Thoughts of the latter steered him to a state of fevered activity. About midday he arose, dressed, and went out. He told his wife that he was going to the office, but he had no intention of doing so. He went drunk off his coffee at a place up in the Marais. He was terrified of his old haunts. He wandered from place to place, uncertain how to act. Late in the afternoon, he entered a cafe in Rue Alibert. At a kiosk outside, he bought a late edition of an afternoon newspaper. He sat down, ordered a drink, and opened the newspaper. He glanced at the central news page, and as his eye absorbed one paragraph, he unconsciously uttered a low scream. The paragraph was as follows: Mysterious affair at Chantilly. A mysterious affair occurred at Chantilly this morning. A middle-aged man named Paul Daniel complained of pains in the stomach after eating an omelette. He died soon after in great agony. He was staying with his aunt, Ma Thailandier. No other members of the household were affected. The matter is to be inquired into. The rest was a dream. He was only vaguely conscious of the events which followed. He wandered through it all, the instinct of self-preservation bidding him hold his tongue in all circumstances. He knew nothing. He had seen nothing. He had a visionary recollection of a plump, weeping Ernestine at the inquest, enlarging upon the eccentricities of her mistress, a queer woman who would brook no contradiction. He heard a lot about the fish day and the souffle day, and how the old lady insisted that this was a fish day and that she had a souffle day the before. You could not argue with her when she was like that, and Ernestine had beaten up the eggs all ready for the souffle, most provoking. But Ernestine was a good cook of method and economy. She wasted nothing. What should she do with the eggs? Why, of course, Mr. Paul, who since he had come to live there was never content with a cafe complete. He must have a breakfast, like these English and other foreigners too. She made him an omelette, which he ate heartily. Then the beaten up eggs with their deadly mixture were intended for Ma Thailandier. But who was responsible for this? Ernestine. But there was no motive here. Ernestine gained nothing by her mistress's death. Indeed, she only stood to lose her situation. Motive? Was it possible that she deceased? The enquiry went on a long while. Henry himself was conscious of being in the witness box. He knew nothing. He couldn't understand it. His brother would not be likely to do that. He himself was prostrate with grief. He loved his brother. There was nothing to do but return an open verdict. Shadowy figures passed before his mind's eye. Shadowy figures and shadowy realizations. He had perfectly murdered his brother. The whole of the dividends of the estate would one day be his and his wife's and children's. 18,000 francs a year. One day, one vision more vivid than the rest, the old lady on the day following the inquest, seated bolt upright at her table like a figure of perpetuity, playing the old grey paroquet, stroking its mangy neck. There's a pretty lady. Oh, my sweet. Another nice crepe for my little one. There's a pretty lady.